What was life really like for the builders of Nineveh 2,700 years ago? And what needed to be endured every single day so that walls could rise and palaces could stand? For centuries, we have imagined ancient construction as something simple, reduced to nameless laborers moving stones. But reality was harsher, slower, and built on systems of control we can barely imagine. Before building, one had to quarry, haul across mountains, shape under the sun, fire in kilns, and obey without question. Every brick carried sweat, risk, and dependence on forces beyond control. Building was not craft nor choice, it was obligation. In this video, we are not only going to talk about what was built at that time, we are going to walk through the path of construction from the quarry to the kiln, from the mud pit to the palace wall, from dawn to exhaustion, and understand how this process shaped lives, broke bodies, and built empire. When we observe how Nineveh rose from the earth, ancient history gains. Human weight and daily life reveals deeper truths about power, survival, and forgotten suffering. Stay until the end, because what you are about to discover may change how you understand ancient civilizations and reveal what it cost in human terms to build monuments that still define our image of ancient power. In the time of Nineveh's greatest expansion, the city was the beating heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the largest city in the world around 700 BC. Ruled by kings like Sennacherib, who reigned from 704 to 681 BC, and Ashurbanipal, who followed from 669 to 631 BC, Nineveh covered 750 hectares, surrounded by massive walls stretching 12 kilometers with 15 fortified gates piercing their length. Between 100,000 and 150,000 people lived within those walls at the city's peak, a population density that strained every resource. This city was not built in years. It was built over generations through organized, massive labor mobilization. Thousands of workers moved in coordination, some skilled craftsmen, others conscripted citizens fulfilling obligations to the state, many prisoners of war torn from conquered lands and enslaved peoples with no choice at all. This was not construction as we imagine it. This was imperial transformation, written in mud and stone, requiring coordination on a scale that would challenge even modern projects. Nothing rose quickly. Nothing came without cost. The life of countless families was tied to the rhythm of construction, to quotas that had to be met and to forces they could not resist. Building began long before stones were stacked or walls rose from the earth. It began in distant places with breaking earth and breaking the rhythm of ordinary life. It began in the mountains where stone waited to be torn from bedrock, in clay pits where mud would become millions of bricks, and in forests hundreds of kilometers away where timber grew for roofs that would span royal halls. In the time of Nineveh's builders, construction began long, before walls rose from the earth. It began in the mountains, in the clay pits, in places where materials waited to be torn from nature. Building meant accepting impossibility. Before walls, before bricks, before anything resembled a city, materials had to be gathered from hostile distances. Stone, clay, timber, bitumen, metal, water. Nothing appeared ready. Nothing was nearby. Nothing came without cost. Work began in places far from Nineveh, in conditions that tested human endurance, and it demanded everything. Massive stone blocks for palace foundations, gates, and protective lamassu, those winged bulls with human heads, came from quarries in the Zagros Mountains dozens of kilometers away through difficult terrain. Workers used copper and bronze tools. There was no steel, no iron chisels, no explosives. Hammer and wedge, hour after hour, day after day. Splitting stone along natural faults meant driving wooden wedges into cracks, soaking them with water until the wood expanded and rock split, or heating rock faces with fire, then dousing with cold water so thermal shock created fractures. One mistake, a wrong angle or too much force, shattered months of careful work. Heavy blocks, some weighing 30 tons for the great lamassu, had to be moved down mountainsides using wooden sledges, log rollers, and ropes braided from animal hide and plant fiber. Strength came only from human bodies pulling in coordination, Paths had to be cleared, slopes managed. Men pulled, men stumbled, men died under shifting loads. Most of Nineveh was built not from stone, but from sun-dried mud brick. Clay was extracted from riverbanks along the Tigris and nearby wadis, mixed with chopped straw for binding strength, water, and sometimes animal dung. Shaped by hand in rectangular wooden molds with standardized dimensions for stacking, bricks were laid in the sun to dry for days. Summer heat reaching 45 degrees Celsius dried bricks fast but exhausted workers. Unexpected rain could destroy thousands of unbaked bricks in minutes, weeks of work lost. Heat cracked them if drying was too rapid, moisture weakened them if too slow. Every brick required digging clay, hauling water from the river, gathering and chopping straw, mixing by trampling with feet, molding, drying, stacking, transporting. Nothing was instant, nothing was certain. A single palace wall required tens of thousands of bricks. The entire city with its walls, temples, palaces, and houses demanded hundreds of millions. But gathering materials did not end the effort. What came from mountains, clay pits, and distant forests was still not ready to become a city. After materials arrived at Nineveh, construction still could not begin. Everything needed transformation, refinement, preparation. Clay became brick, stone became carved blocks, ore became tools, logs became beams. This transformation occupied specialized workers in dedicated areas outside the city. Nothing was automatic, nothing was fast. Each element required repeated, silent, physical work. And mistakes meant starting over. Brick-making was not occasional craft. It was continuous industrial-scale production. Dedicated brick-making zones were established in flat areas with clay and water access. Workers organized in specialized teams operating like assembly lines. Clay diggers excavated and stockpiled. Water haulers carried from the river in leather bags or clay jars. Straw preparers chopped and measured binding material. Mixers trampled clay, water, and straw together in pits, an exhausting, repetitive motion. Molders filled wooden frames, struck off excess, and turned out wet bricks onto the ground. Arrangers spaced bricks for drying, ensuring air circulation. Turners flipped bricks midway through drying to prevent warping. Stackers moved finished bricks to storage areas. The rhythm never stopped. Dig, haul, mix, mold, dry, turn, stack, repeat. Thousands of bricks produced per day, every day for years without pause. Work followed seasons. Rainy months from November to March limited production. Summer heat was ally and enemy. It accelerated drying but caused heat exhaustion and dehydration. There was no shade, no breaks except for water rations. For important structures, kiln-fired bricks were needed because they were harder, waterproof, more durable. Kilns had to be constructed from brick themselves and fed constantly with fuel. Wood was scarce, so mostly dried dung, reeds, and straw were burned. Temperature control required experience passed from master to apprentice. Too hot, and bricks cracked or melted. Too cool, and bricks remained weak. Each firing cycle took days and produced hundreds of bricks. Every finished brick represented a small victory over entropy, nature, limitation. But there was no celebration, only the next batch, waiting. Raw stone blocks arrived, irregular, rough, dangerous to handle. They had to be shaped, smoothed, squared for construction. Workers used bronze chisels, stone, hammers, and abrasive sand. Slow, repetitive striking, thousands of blows to remove material, dust filled the air and lungs, causing respiratory disease over time. The massive lamassu, those protective figures of human-headed winged bulls, were carved from single blocks of limestone or alabaster and required years of work, roughing out the form, detailing feathers, faces, and cuneiform inscriptions. One wrong strike could ruin irreplaceable stone. Eyes strained in whatever light was available. Hands bled from repetitive motion. Construction consumed tools at a staggering rate. Bronze and copper chisels, hammers, and saws dulled quickly on stone and hard clay. Constant sharpening was required. Metalworkers operated furnaces continuously, melting, casting, forging. Broken tools were not discarded because metal was too valuable. They were collected, melted down, and recast into new tools. When materials were finally transformed into usable form, one essential stage still remained. The UAM, actual construction, where thousands of workers moved in coordination, where mistakes cost lives, and where the city finally began to rise from the earth. With materials prepared and ready, the moment arrived when Nineveh would finally take shape from the earth, when coordination replaced chaos and the city's massive walls, temples, and palaces began their slow ascent toward the sky. Construction was not simple stacking. It was orchestrated human movement on a scale that defied comprehension, where thousands of bodies moved as one organism, each person a small part of something far larger than themselves. Supervisors stood on elevated platforms shouting instructions that echoed across work zones stretching hundreds of meters. Scribes recorded daily progress in cuneiform on clay tablets, tracking brick counts, worker assignments, and quota fulfillment. Every detail mattered because the king demanded completion, and failure meant punishment that could extend to entire families. Foundation trenches were dug first, sometimes 4 meters deep, filled with compacted rubble and layers of reed matting to stabilize ground prone to shifting from seasonal flooding. Workers descended into pits with bronze tools, removing earth basket by basket, hauling it away in endless chains of human transport. The smell of disturbed soil mixed with sweat and fear. Foundation work meant confined spaces where cave-ins buried workers without warning, where one moment of inattention ended lives instantly. Once foundations were set, bricklaying began in earnest. Teams worked in coordinated rows, mortar made from mud mixed with chopped straw spread between courses. Experienced masons ensured level placement using weighted plumb lines and wooden measuring rods. Walls rose slowly, perhaps 1 meter per week for major structures, requiring constant vertical alignment checks. Workers stood on wooden scaffolding lashed together with rope, platforms swaying dangerously as men moved across. Them carrying bricks stacked on their backs. Heights grew, risk multiplied, falls killed regularly, bodies removed quickly to avoid disrupting workflow. Water was the invisible foundation of everything. Without constant supply, mortar dried incorrectly, workers collapsed from dehydration, and progress stopped entirely. Water carriers formed human chains from the Tigris River to construction sites, passing heavy clay vessels hand to hand, hour after hour, day after day. Children as young as 8 participated, carrying smaller loads, learning the rhythm of endless labor. Women mixed mortar, prepared food for workers, and carried lighter materials. No one was exempt. The entire city participated in its own creation, whether by choice, by obligation, or by force. Coordination extended beyond human labor to managing supply chains that connected quarries, clay pits, forests, and the construction site itself. Donkey caravans arrived daily carrying materials that had to be unloaded, sorted, and distributed to specific work zones. Delays meant idle workers and wasted time that supervisors recorded as failures. Pressure descended from the king through administrators, through supervisors, finally crushing those at the bottom who had no voice, no choice, no escape from the machine of empire demanding its monument. The rhythm of construction consumed everything. Days blurred into months, months into years, and still the work continued without mercy or pause. Workers rose before dawn when darkness still held the earth, moving toward construction sites guided only by torches and the knowledge that absence meant punishment. Overseers waited at gathering points, counting bodies, recording names on clay tablets that determined who received rations and who faced consequences for failing to appear. There was no weekend, no concept of rest as we understand it. Work paused only for major religious festivals when the king declared cessation, perhaps 10 to 15 days scattered across the year. Otherwise, every sunrise brought the same demand, the same quotas, the same relentless expectation that materials would move and walls would rise regardless of exhaustion, injury, or despair. Food arrived in communal distributions, measured carefully to provide just enough energy for continued labor. Workers received barley, the staple grain, ground into flour for flatbread, sometimes supplemented with onions, garlic, dates, and occasionally small amounts of fish or meat for those performing the hardest tasks. Water rations were distributed from large ceramic vessels at intervals throughout the day, though never quite enough during summer months when thirst became constant companion. Hunger was normal. Malnutrition weakened bodies over time, making workers vulnerable to disease and injury. Children born during construction years grew up malnourished, their growth stunted, their futures predetermined by the empire's insatiable appetite for monuments. Injuries occurred daily, with brutal regularity. Falls from scaffolding shattered bones that never healed properly, leaving men crippled and unable to work, dependent on family charity or left to beg. Heavy stones crushed feet, hands, entire limbs. Ropes braided from hide and fiber snapped under tension, whipping back to slash faces and blind eyes. Respiratory diseases developed from years of breathing stone dust, causing men to cough blood and struggle for breath until death arrived as relief. Heat stroke claimed workers during summer peaks when temperatures exceeded human tolerance. Bodies collapsed mid-task, sometimes revived with water, often carried away and replaced immediately with fresh workers. Medical knowledge was limited to basic remedies, herbs, and prayers to gods who seemed distant from the suffering below. Serious injuries meant slow death because there were no hospitals, no concept of worker compensation, no safety systems to protect those whose bodies built imperial glory. The psychological weight proved as crushing as physical demands. Workers understood their individual lives meant nothing to the project's completion. They were interchangeable parts in a machine that valued only output. Families lived in temporary housing near construction sites, mud brick structures barely adequate for shelter, overcrowded and unsanitary. Disease spread rapidly through these quarters, claiming children and elderly first. Women bore the double burden of domestic labor and participation in lighter construction tasks, their bodies worn by childbirth and endless work. Social bonds formed among workers as survival mechanism, small acts of kindness and shared suffering creating fragile communities within the larger dehumanizing system. Yet, resistance was nearly impossible. Guards patrolled constantly, watching for signs of deliberate slowdown or sabotage. Punishment was public and severe, floggings administered where all could witness, occasionally execution for serious infractions or escape attempts. The empire had perfected control through fear, scarcity, and the understanding that individual defiance changed nothing when the system itself was absolute. And so they continued, generation after generation, building monuments that would outlast their suffering, creating beauty through broken bodies, raising walls that would stand for millennia while their names disappeared into dust and silence, forgotten by history that remembers only kings and stones. Construction was never neutral. It was conquest written in architecture, power made visible through forced labor, and empire sustained by systems that valued completion over human dignity. The workers who built Nineveh came from three distinct categories, each experiencing different degrees of coercion, yet all bound to the project by forces beyond their control. Citizens of the empire itself owed corvée labor, periodic service to the state that was considered civic obligation rather than slavery. For farmers and craftsmen, this meant leaving fields and workshops for weeks or months at a time, traveling to Nineveh to fulfill quotas assigned by regional administrators. They received minimal compensation, usually food rations, and the understanding that compliance meant their families would not face retribution. These workers formed the backbone of routine construction, the steady flow of local labor that sustained progress between major campaigns. Prisoners of war represented the second category, captives from conquered territories throughout the Neo-Assyrian Empire's vast reach. Assyrian military campaigns were specifically designed to acquire labor for imperial projects, with deportation policy explicitly stated in royal inscriptions. Sennacherib himself boasted of transplanting entire populations, moving skilled workers from distant cities to serve Nineveh's construction needs. These deportees were not technically slaves in the legal sense, but possessed no freedom to return home, no choice about their labor, no ownership of their own lives. They built the monuments of their conquerors while remembering cities that no longer existed, families scattered across empire, identities erased by imperial bureaucracy that reduced them to numbers on clay tablets recording work assignments and ration distributions. True slaves formed the third category, people owned as property, bought and sold in markets, inherited through generations, treated as tools that could be worked until broken and then replaced. Temple slaves served religious institutions that participated in construction projects. Private slaves belonged to wealthy families and were sometimes hired out for building work. War captives who resisted or attempted escape were reduced to slave status as punishment. Children born to slave mothers inherited bondage regardless of their father's status, creating permanent underclass that sustained imperial infrastructure through generations. These workers received bare subsistence, slept in the harshest conditions, and faced the most dangerous tasks because their lives held the least value in the eyes of those who controlled the empire's machinery. Coordination of such diverse labor required sophisticated administrative systems. Royal scribes maintained detailed records tracking worker origins, skills, task assignments, and output. Cuneiform tablets discovered by archaeologists reveal bureaucracy's obsessive concern with productivity, listing daily brick counts, measuring construction progress against predetermined schedules, noting deficiencies that would trigger investigations. Supervisors were themselves supervised, creating hierarchy of control that extended from the king's palace down to individual work crews. The system was designed to prevent solidarity among workers, to isolate groups from each other to ensure that no collective resistance could form across ethnic, linguistic, or status boundaries that divided those whose labor built. Empire. Violence was not incidental but structural, woven into every aspect of the construction process. Beatings motivated workers who moved too slowly or failed to meet quotas. Public punishments reminded entire work crews of consequences for disobedience. Guards carrying weapons stood at construction sites not to protect workers but to control them, to prevent escape, to maintain order through threat of immediate harm. The palace archives contain letters from supervisors requesting more workers to replace those who died or became incapacitated. Requests written in the same bureaucratic tone used for ordering copper tools or requesting additional brick deliveries. Human life was resource to be managed, calculated, expended in pursuit of architectural grandeur. Yet within this system of control, small acts of resistance occurred in ways that left few traces for history to record. Workers might deliberately work slowly when supervision was lax, a subtle sabotage that extended timelines without triggering punishment. Skilled craftsmen might make minor errors in less visible sections, small defiances invisible to overseers, but meaningful to those who carved them. Songs were sung in languages supervisors could not understand, preserving cultural memory and creating moments of solidarity among the oppressed. These resistances changed nothing fundamental about the system, but allowed workers to maintain some fragment of autonomy, some sense that, despite everything taken from them, something internal remained unconquered. The empire understood this tension and responded with calculated mixture of coercion and incentive. Exceptional workers received extra rations or assignment to less dangerous tasks. Festivals and religious ceremonies provided brief respite, moments when the grinding machinery paused and workers could remember they were human. But these concessions were strategic, designed to sustain productivity rather than acknowledge dignity, to extract maximum labor while preventing rebellion that would disrupt the larger project of imperial expansion.